So I was once at a social gathering that included a few Catholic priests, which isn't all that uncommon. And it was somewhat chaotic, the atmosphere that we were in. There were people coming and going, there were multiple rooms. And as the evening progressed, some of these priests were asked or expected to perform some pastoral duty, like offer a prayer or give a blessing. And at least for me, as they performed these pastoral tasks, there was this striking contrast that emerged between the sensibilities of the various priests, revealing that some were, I would say, more traditional. They tended to be the younger ones there, and some were more unorthodox, and they tended to be the older ones. So, for example, at one point in the evening, one of the younger priests was leaving, and someone asked if he could bless those of us who were there before he went. So as he gestured to give us a blessing, everyone knelt down as we received the blessing in a very routine, standard way. At another point, an older, less orthodox priest was also leaving, and the same request was made again of him. But this time, the discrepancy in their attitude about their pastoral role became really obvious, because when everyone knelt down for this blessing, the older priest became flustered and bashful by the response, and he remarked something like in a jovial way, but he said something like, that's not necessary. It was almost as if we had embarrassed him by responding to his blessing in this way. And earlier in the evening, that same priest was asked to bless the food, and when he saw that everyone was about to stand to pray with him, he quickly instructed, please, no, everyone just stay seated where you are. Which all seemed really strange to me, because our instinct to stand or to kneel at certain times of prayer simply reflected our sensibilities and our desire to participate in those prayers in the appropriate way. But they were obviously sensibilities that for some reason made him feel very uncomfortable. And I should say that it wasn't like he was just trying to be malicious or contemptuous towards us. It was as if what we were doing affected him, and he wanted to avoid those implications. And for whatever reason, those experiences stuck with me. And as I ran through those memories in my mind and reflected on them, I came to realize that the reason he responded the way that he did was because he thought that our gestures were aimed at him. He thought that when we knelt down for his blessing, that our expression of humility was aimed at him rather than the God whose blessing we were anticipating. When we signaled that we were going to stand up when he prayed grace for us, he felt that we were standing in honor of him and what he was going to say. Why else would he become so flustered by our expressions and want to avoid them? Either it was because he holds standard acts of piety in the Catholic faith in contempt, and he didn't give off that impression to me, so that's not the conclusion I was drawing. So the alternative is that those gestures made him feel uncomfortable, and why else would they do that unless it made him feel excessively honored? So out of a misplaced sense of humility, he asked us to refrain from making such profound acts of honor. But again, he didn't seem to appreciate that when we did so, we were directing that honor towards God and not towards him necessarily, which left me wondering, how did he come to misplace himself in this context so dramatically? That experience also reminded me of times when I've seen lay people attempt to kiss the hand of a priest or the ring of a bishop, and it not go very smoothly. It's an uncommon thing to do and to see these days, so I expect most priests aren't expecting it, but whenever I have seen someone try it, the cleric on the receiving end often responds out of embarrassment, or worse, they try to pull away. Another experience that shaped my perception on this particular topic was when my family and I were on vacation, and so we were visiting a parish that was obviously not our own. And you know how you can experience the same thing over and over again, but suddenly when you do so in a new environment or something slight has changed, all of a sudden it gives you a fresh perspective about it. In this case, this parish and its liturgical approach was very similar to my home parish, so it all felt very familiar. But because it was in a new environment, it was like I was able to watch it with fresh eyes, almost like I was experiencing it for the first time. And what stood out to me was the way that this priest began the Mass, because after the entrance procession, he immediately walked out from behind the altar to stand at the front of the sanctuary to greet all the people who had gathered. And that wasn't unfamiliar to me, but for whatever reason, when I was witnessing it in this context, I couldn't shake the parallels I saw between this priest standing in front of the altar, facing and greeting and interacting with the people, to a stereotypical late night TV monologue where the host of the show comes out from behind the curtains and then stands at the front of the stage to address his audience. It was striking how much it reminded me of that, and I couldn't help but be startled and even a bit repelled by the similarities, because at the end of the day, the priest is not a host or an MC, and if we're going to see parallels, it should be between the priest and Christ rather than the priest and, I don't know, like Jimmy Fallon. So those memories stand out for me when I reflect on what seems to be a common problem in the church today, which is that priests and ministers seem to think that such acts of piety are directed towards them rather than towards God. If I were to kiss a bishop's ring, I wouldn't be doing it out of reverence for him personally, but rather for his office and the splendor of apostolic succession made manifest for every generation, and in that case, for me. When we knelt down for a blessing at this social gathering, we weren't kneeling for him, but for God in worship. But something in church life today has caused our priests to think that such acts of piety are for their sake, rather than for God's sake. So it got me thinking about why this seems to be more pervasive than it should be. And I should qualify that by saying that this isn't every priest, but it's enough of them that it seems to be a common issue in the church. Because ideally, they're supposed to direct our attention towards Christ and the Father instead of themselves. It should be obvious to them that the attention shown by a community or a congregation towards them is because they are a conduit in the person of Christ. We honor Christ through our priests, not the priests through Christ. In the words of St. John the Baptist, he must increase and I must decrease. But for some reason, it's as if many of our priests seem to think that they function in the role of host or an MC, where so much of the value of what happens in worship or liturgy depends on their charisma and their ability to perform, their abilities as a host. And frankly, that's not good, because most Catholic priests just aren't very charismatic, which is why when they mistake themselves for that role and try to lean into it, the life of the party, the host of the show or the MC, it tends to come off as really cringeworthy. It's like watching someone who is really not funny try to make everyone laugh. In fact, it isn't just like that. It actually is that often. And that doesn't bode well for our church, because if the quality of our liturgy and our worship depends on the charisma of the pastor or the priest, then at best our liturgy is going to be notoriously inconsistent. And the reality is most Catholic priests are not terribly charismatic. So our prospects aren't looking terribly promising based on that. And this is even more apparent in Protestant services for obvious reasons, because they really do depend on the charisma of the pastor, because his preaching is usually the key focal point of the whole show. He really is the object of attention in most of their formats. But in liturgy, the object of attention is supposed to be in worship directed towards God. It's like the difference between an actor who is hired to deliver lines for a play or a movie and an actor who is hired to improvise and to perform their own humor or their own material. In the former example, the person is just meant to disappear into that role, a role that has been written for them. In the latter example, the actor steps into the spotlight and radiates with their own personality and their own talent. And it seems to me that too many of our Catholic priests today seem to think that that is what's being required of them in their role as ministers and worship leaders. And I would say that part of the reason this misconception has been encouraged lies in the state of our liturgy today. And now, before I go on here, some people tend to freak out when anyone criticizes the liturgy, but here's the thing, there's nothing wrong with constructively criticizing aspects of our liturgy with the aim of reform. And the reason I know that is because the liturgical reformers of the 20th century had to criticize the old liturgy in order to compose the new one. They had to take an honest look at the liturgy, define what they believed was inadequate about it, and then try to remedy those problems. So if that was valid then it's valid today. Either we can criticize the liturgy or we can't. But if we can't, then what the so-called reformers did back in the 1960s was utterly invalid and never should have happened. But also, if I'm being totally honest here, I wish it wasn't this way. As soon as they took a liturgy that had slowly and organically developed over centuries and reworked it at the hands of a committee, it set the precedent that liturgy is something that we invent ourselves, rather than something that we inherit, something that is given to us by the church acting under the direction of the Holy Spirit, that it is something that we treasure and then reverently pass on. That precedent has created little liturgy critics out of all of us, myself included, because now we become aware of variation. When you have variation, you invite preference and then therefore criticism. That's just an inevitable effect. If I show up at an ice cream shop and all they have are vanilla cones, I either take it or I leave it. But if they have a variety of flavors, well, suddenly now I've been invited to become a connoisseur with preferences. And as soon as you say yes to one of many, you're necessarily saying no to all the others. And that's what variety in liturgy has done. It's divided us along the lines of our own particular preferences, which should never happen with worship. Worship is supposed to galvanize us together as a community, but now we suffer under this climate of liturgical preference and therefore division. But what variation also creates is a climate in which priests think that it's incumbent upon them to design our liturgical experience, to be the improvisational actor on the stage. And we literally see this. Whenever I attend a Novus Ordo, I'm struck by all the little improvisations and insertions that the priest adds that just aren't there in the missal or in the rubrics. And it's hard to blame him when there are options built into the missal. The priest changes from someone who simply performs what is written to one who composes what is then performed. The liturgy then becomes a reflection of his preferences and personality. So it's no wonder that they end up falling into the trap of thinking that they are the focal point in all of this, like the host of a show. Add on to the fact that they're now facing the congregation the way a performer does, creating this impression that the dialogue is between the priest and the congregation rather than the whole congregation to God. Suddenly you've added to the temptation for them to think that they must increase while God decreases in the background without even realizing that that's what's going on. And so as a result, when their audience makes gestures of extravagant prostration and humility and worship, they mistake those gestures as being directed towards them rather than towards God. And as a result, they can naturally become embarrassed by that. And out of that embarrassment, they end up discouraging us from doing so. Because they're right, we shouldn't treat mere men with a kind of reverence that should be reserved for God alone. But it's only a problem when they keep getting caught in the middle. And this kind of thing just doesn't happen in the old form of the Mass because there was no variety. The priest simply went up to the altar and performed the words and the actions that were scripted for him. His personality, his preferences, his charisma or lack thereof, those just didn't factor in. They were irrelevant in the practice of the traditional liturgy. So the first thing I would want to say in conclusion for our priests, but also for anyone working in ministry, is don't discourage people from making those kinds of gestures of piety. They want to express their deep love and worship for God. It's not about you. And if you find yourself feeling embarrassed, like you're caught in the middle, perhaps take some time to reflect on your role as a minister and as a pastor to assess if it's possible you've fallen into the mistake of thinking of yourself like you're the host or an MC and therefore end up in the middle. The other thing I would implore all of us to consider is how we can promote some necessary reform in the liturgy to avoid the risks we seem to be falling into. If we can't offer the worship that is due to God without making our pastors feel embarrassed, then something about the orientation or the form of our liturgy needs reform and correction. And again, it's okay to talk about that as long as we aren't denigrating valid worship in the process, and as long as our aim is to reform the liturgy for the good of the church. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support, so if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.